The salt wind hit Lord Thaddeus Vance square in the face as he stepped off the hired coach and onto the cobblestones of Brimstone Bay. He pulled his collar higher and tugged the brim of his hat low over his eyes. A duke had no business in a port town at midnight. Then again, a duke had no business losing sleep over a gone man's stolen treasure either. And yet, here he was. 3 months. That was how long the Ethelgard relics had been missing from his father's private vault. 3 months of sleepless nights, cold leads, and useless constables who smiled politely and promised results that never came. His late father, the previous Duke of Oakhaven, had spent 40 years collecting those relics. 9th-century gold, jewel-encrusted crosses, Saxon chalices older than most family bloodlines in England. And someone had walked right through the walls of Ravenwood Keep and carried them off like a sack of potatoes from a kitchen cellar. Thaddeus had received a tip 2 days ago from a dock worker who owed a gambling debt to one of his tenant farmers. The word was simple. If you want to find what was taken, go to the Velvet Lantern on the eve of the new moon. Ask for nothing. Watch everything. So here he stood, dressed in a rough-spun traveling cloak that smelled faintly of horse and wood smoke, looking every bit like a merchant down on his luck. The disguise was necessary. His face was known in society circles from London to Bath, and the kind of men who frequented the Velvet Lantern did not take kindly to nobility poking around their dealings. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The tavern swallowed him whole. Pipe smoke curled thick under the low beams, and the smell of cheap ale and tallow candles filled his lungs. A fiddler in the corner played something slow and tuneless. Sailors hunched over their cups. A woman with a lined face wiped down the bar with a rag that looked dirtier than the counter itself. Nobody looked up. That suited him fine. Thaddeus ordered a pint he had no intention of drinking and settled into a dark booth near the back wall. From here he could see the entire room. The entrance, the staircase leading to private rooms above, the narrow corridor that led out to the alley behind the building. He waited. 20 minutes crawled by. A group of fishermen argued about the price of cod. A young sailor arm-wrestled an older one and lost badly. The fiddler switched to a song that sounded almost identical to the first. Then the door opened again, and a figure slipped inside. She was dressed in a dark green traveling cloak with the hood drawn up, but the way she moved caught his attention immediately. Quick, light on her feet. She crossed the room without bumping a single chair, without drawing a single glance from the men around her. Whoever she was, she had done this before. She sat down in the far corner, her back against the wall, and waited with her hands folded on the table. A minute later, a broad-shouldered man with a thick grey beard and sun-beaten skin joined her. A sea captain by the look of his coat and the way he carried himself. He sat across from her and leaned in close. Thaddeus narrowed his eyes. He was too far away to hear their words, but he could see the exchange clearly. The woman reached into her cloak and produced a leather-bound book, slim and worn at the edges. She slid it across the table. The captain examined it briefly, then nodded once and placed something in her open palm. A key, small, iron, old. Thaddeus gripped the edge of his table. A leather-bound inventory and an iron key. This was it. This was the trail he had been chasing for months. Whoever this woman was, she was involved in the movement of stolen goods, and she had just handed over what looked like a record of every item taken. He had to get closer. He had to see her face. He stood up carefully, keeping his head low, and began weaving through the tables toward her corner. 3 steps. 5 steps. Almost there. The candlelight from the nearest sconce flickered across her profile as she turned slightly to tuck the key into her bodice. And the ground fell out from under him. He knew that face. The gentle slope of her jaw, the way she tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. the small, almost invisible scar just above her left eyebrow, from when she had tripped carrying a breakfast tray last winter. Genevieve Mercer. His maid. The quietest woman in all of Ravenwood Keep. The girl who could barely meet his eyes when she delivered his morning tea. The one who dusted his study with her gaze permanently fixed on the floor, who spoke in a voice so soft that the housekeeper was always telling her to speak up.
That Genevieve Mercer was sitting in a smuggler's tavern at midnight, conducting business with a sea captain like she owned the entire port. His mind went blank, completely, utterly blank. And in that single frozen moment of disbelief, his hip caught the edge of a side table. The oil lantern sitting on it wobbled, tipped, and crashed to the floor with a sound like a gunshot in a cathedral. Glass shattered. Burning oil spread across the floorboards in a bright orange streak. The fiddler stopped playing. Every head in the tavern turned toward Thaddeus, who stood there like a statue with his mouth half open and his disguise suddenly feeling very thin. The sea captain was on his feet in an instant, one hand inside his coat. The barmaid shouted for someone to bring water. 2 sailors scrambled to stamp out the flames with their boots. And Genevieve was gone. He spun around, searching the room wildly, but she had already vanished. The back corridor, the alley door. She had melted into the fog like she had never existed at all. The only proof that she had been there was the faint scent of lavender soap still hanging in the air where she had sat, the same soap she used to clean the linens at Ravenwood Keep. By the time Thaddeus stumbled out into the cold night air, the alley was empty. The fog had rolled in thick from the harbor, swallowing the streets whole. He stood there, chest heaving, rain beginning to spot his cloak, and tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. His shy, invisible, wouldn't-say-boo-to-a-goose housemaid had just traded stolen artifact records with a sailor in a criminal tavern and disappeared into the night like a phantom. Either the world had gone completely mad, or Thaddeus Vance had never truly seen the woman living under his own roof. He clenched his jaw, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the coaching inn where his horse waited. He would be back at Ravenwood Keep by morning, and Genevieve Mercer was going to answer every single question burning a hole through his skull, whether she liked it or not. Thaddeus arrived at Ravenwood Keep just after sunrise, his boots caked in mud and his mind running in circles. He had not slept. The entire ride back from Brimstone Bay, he had replayed that moment in the tavern over and over again. The leather book, the iron key, the calm, practiced way Genevieve had handled the whole affair. Every mile of road had brought a new question and 0 answers. He handed his horse off to the stable boy without a word and entered through the servants' door at the rear of the house. The kitchen was already alive with the clatter of pots and the warm smell of bread baking. Mrs. Alford, the head cook, gave him a curious look as he passed through, but she had worked for the Vance family long enough to know when not to ask questions. He climbed the back staircase to the main floor and found Jennings, his head butler, laying out the Morning Post on the silver tray in the entrance hall. "Jennings, where is Genevieve assigned today?" The old butler blinked. In 12 years of service, the Duke had never once asked about the schedule of a junior housemaid. "Laundry, Your Grace. She began at 6:30, as usual." "Very good. See that she is not disturbed from her duties until I say otherwise." "Of course, Your Grace." Thaddeus took the stairs 2 at a time. His heart was beating faster than it should have been for a man simply walking through his own house. He turned left at the top of the landing and made his way down the narrow corridor that led to the servants' wing. He had been through this part of the house perhaps twice in his entire life. The wallpaper was older here, faded to a dull yellow, and the floorboards creaked with every step. Genevieve's room was the last on the right, a small door with a plain brass handle. No lock. Servants' quarters at Ravenwood Keep were modest but well kept, each room furnished with a bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a trunk for personal belongings. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was spotless.
The bed was made with military precision, the corners tucked tight enough to bounce a coin off. A single candle sat on the washstand beside a bar of lavender soap, the same lavender he had smelled at the tavern. His stomach tightened. He checked the wardrobe first. 2 plain gray dresses, a Sunday dress in dark blue, a woolen shawl, an apron. Everything a housemaid should own, and nothing she shouldn't. Then he knelt beside the trunk at the foot of the bed. It was a simple thing, oak with iron hinges, the kind issued to every servant in the household. He opened the lid. Folded undergarments, a prayer book, a small bundle of dried flowers tied with string. He almost closed it, almost stood up and told himself he had imagined the whole thing in Brimstone Bay. Lack of sleep, too much worry over the relics, a trick of the candlelight. But his fingers found the seam. Along the bottom of the trunk, hidden beneath a false panel of thin wood covered in fabric, there was a gap. He pressed down on one end, and the other lifted with a faint click. Beneath it lay a compartment no deeper than 2 inches, lined with oilskin to keep out moisture. What he found inside made him sit back on his heels. A rolled set of maps, drawn with extraordinary detail, showing the layout of coastal vaults and underground storage chambers along the southern shore of England. Each one was marked with small symbols he did not recognize. Beside the maps lay a thin leather wallet containing 3 documents written entirely in cipher. The letters and numbers meant nothing to him, but the handwriting was neat, confident, and deliberate. This was the work of someone trained in coded communication. And beneath everything else, folded inside a square of black velvet, sat 2 wax seals. He picked one up and held it to the light from the window. The impression was unmistakable. A crown above a pair of crossed keys, surrounded by a laurel wreath. He had seen this seal once before, years ago, when his father had hosted a quiet dinner for 3 men from London who never gave their full names. His father had told him afterwards, in that low, serious voice he used for important things, that those men worked for the Crown's Antiquities League, a secretive body tasked with protecting the historical treasures of the realm from theft, forgery, and smuggling. Thaddeus stared at the seal in his palm. His housemaid was carrying the official credentials of the Crown's Antiquities League in a hidden compartment in her trunk. He put everything back exactly as he had found it, closed the false panel, and shut the trunk. Then he left the room, pulling the door shut behind him, and walked straight to his private study on the 2nd floor. He sat behind his desk and waited. At 10:30, a soft knock came at the door. "Enter." Genevieve stepped inside, carrying the morning's post on a small tray. She was dressed in her usual gray uniform, her dark hair pinned back under a white cap, her eyes lowered in that familiar, quiet way that now struck him as something else entirely. A performance. A mask worn so long it had become second nature. She placed the letters on the corner of his desk and turned to leave. "Close the door, Genevieve." She stopped. Her hand was already on the handle. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in her posture. A tiny stiffening of the shoulders. A brief hesitation that lasted less than a heartbeat. Then she closed the door and turned to face him. "Your Grace?" He leaned back in his chair and studied her. Really studied her, for the first time since she had arrived at his estate 14 months ago. She was perhaps 25, with sharp features softened by a carefully maintained expression of meekness. Her hands were folded in front of her apron. She looked every inch the obedient servant. "I was at the Velvet Lantern last night," he said. The color did not drain from her face. Her hands did not tremble. She did not gasp or stammer or look away. She simply held his gaze with a steadiness that confirmed everything he already suspected. The shy maid was gone. The woman standing before him was someone else altogether. "Then we should talk, Your Grace," she said. preferably somewhere we will not be overheard. The stables at Ravenwood Keep sat at the far western edge of the grounds, well beyond earshot of the main house and the servants' quarters. At this hour, the grooms had finished their evening duties and gone to supper.
The horses stood quiet in their stalls, and the only sound was the soft rustle of hay and the occasional stamp of a hoof against packed earth. Thaddeus had chosen this place deliberately. No passing footmen, no curious housemaids pressing their ears to keyholes. Whatever Genevieve Mercer had to say, he wanted to hear it without the walls of Ravenwood Keep listening. He was leaning against the frame of the carriage house door when she arrived, still in her grey dress and white cap, though she moved differently now. The small, careful steps of a servant had been replaced by a longer, more purposeful stride. She walked like someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. She stopped a few feet from him, hands clasped in front of her, and waited. "Start talking," Thaddeus said. His voice was harder than he intended, but 3 months of frustration and a sleepless night had worn his patience to the bone. "Who are you really, and what were you doing in that tavern?" Genevieve glanced past him into the dim interior of the carriage house, checking that they were truly alone. Then she met his eyes with that same unsettling steadiness from the study. "My name is Genevieve Mercer. That part is real. I was born in Hertfordshire, the daughter of a schoolmaster and a seamstress. I am not nobility, and I am not a criminal." "Then explain the maps in your trunk, the ciphers, the seals of the Crown's Antiquities League." If she was surprised that he had searched her belongings, she did not show it. "I am a field agent for the League, Your Grace. I have been for the past 4 years. I was recruited out of a teaching post in Cambridge by a man named Hargrove, who recognized that I had certain useful qualities: a sharp memory, an unremarkable appearance, the ability to move through wealthy households without attracting attention." "You were planted here." "I was assigned here 14 months ago, after the 3rd major theft of historical artifacts from a noble estate in the south of England. The League identified a pattern. Someone with intimate knowledge of estate security was passing information to an organized smuggling operation. The details being leaked were too specific to come from an outsider. Rotation schedules for night watchmen, locations of private vaults, the timing of when families traveled to London for the season, leaving their country houses exposed. Thaddeus felt something cold settle in his chest. "You are saying the thief is inside my household?" "I am saying the informant is inside one of several households, and yours was among the most likely targets. The Ethelgard relics alone are worth more than some men will see in 10 lifetimes. Your estate was always going to be hit, Your Grace. The only question was when." He pushed off from the doorframe and took a step toward her. "And the tavern? The leather book you handed to that captain?" "Captain Alistair Greaves. He operates a merchant vessel called the Iron Petrel out of Brimstone Bay. He has been transporting stolen relics across the Channel to buyers in France and the Low Countries for the past 2 years. The book I gave him was a falsified inventory designed to make him believe the League has less information than we actually possess. In exchange, he gave me a key to a private warehouse on the Eastern Quay, where a portion of the stolen goods are being held before shipment." "A false inventory." Thaddeus repeated the words slowly, turning them over. "You gave him wrong information on purpose." "Correct. If I had handed him accurate intelligence, the smugglers would have simply moved their operation overnight, and we would have lost the trail entirely. The false inventory buys us time and keeps them confident that their network remains hidden." Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair and turned away from her, pacing toward the nearest stall where his bay mare watched him with large, indifferent eyes. He gripped the top of the stall door and stared at nothing. 14 months. She had been under his roof for 14 months, clearing his breakfast dishes, polishing his silver, folding his linens. And the entire time,
She had been conducting an intelligence operation right beneath his feet.
"Why did you never come to me?" he asked without turning around. "If my estate was a target, I had every right to know."
"With respect, Your Grace, you were also a suspect." He spun around.
"I beg your pardon."
Genevieve's expression remained calm, though he caught the faintest trace of something almost apologetic in her eyes. "Every member of the household was under consideration, including the master of the house. The League does not make exceptions based on title. I was instructed to observe everyone, report everything, and trust no one until the evidence pointed clearly in one direction."
"And does it point in a direction?"
She paused. This was the first time he had seen her hesitate, and somehow that small crack in her composure made everything she had said feel more honest than a sworn oath. "Yes," she said quietly. "I have narrowed the source of the leaks to someone within your senior staff, someone who has served your family long enough to know every detail of the estate's operations and who has regular contact with the outside world through errands, correspondence, or travel." The cold feeling in his chest spread outward. Senior staff. That was a small circle. Jennings the butler, Mrs. Alford the cook, Thomas Blackwell, his personal valet, and Edgar Poole, his estate steward, who managed the finances, the tenants, and the security arrangements for Ravenwood Keep. One of them was a traitor. "I can see your mind working, Your Grace," Genevieve said. "And I would ask you to be careful with your suspicions. If the informant realizes they are being watched, they will disappear, and the smuggling ring will scatter like leaves in October. Patience is the only weapon that works here." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. The candlelight from the stable lantern caught the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, and he felt something shift inside him. Anger giving way to something more complicated. Grudging respect, perhaps. Or the uncomfortable recognition that this woman had been 3 steps ahead of him from the very beginning. "Then what do you need from me?" he asked. Genevieve tilted her head slightly, and for the first time since he had known her, the ghost of a real smile crossed her lips. "Everything you know about Edgar Poole." 2 days passed before they could leave Ravenwood Keep without raising suspicion. Thaddeus made a show of announcing a visit to an old university friend in Oakhaven Valley, a journey common enough that none of the household staff would think twice about it. Genevieve, meanwhile, arranged to take her half-day leave on the same afternoon, telling Mrs. Alford she intended to visit a cousin in the next village. They met at the crossroads a mile south of the estate, where Thaddeus waited in his private carriage with the curtains drawn. Genevieve climbed inside without a word, pulling the door shut behind her. She had changed out of her servant's grey and wore a plain brown traveling dress with a dark shawl. Simple clothes, but she carried herself differently in them. Straighter, more certain. Like a woman finally allowed to stand at her full height. Thaddeus knocked twice on the roof, and the driver urged the horses forward onto the old carriage road that wound through the hills toward Oakhaven Valley. "Tell me about Edgar Poole," Genevieve said, before they had gone half a mile. She had a small leather notebook open on her knee and a pencil in her hand. Thaddeus settled back against the seat cushion. "Edgar has been the estate steward at Ravenwood Keep for 11 years. My father hired him when our previous steward retired to the Lake District. He manages the tenant farms, the household accounts, the upkeep of the grounds, and the security arrangements for the house and its contents." "Including the vault where the Ethelgard relics were stored?" "Including that, yes. He was one of only 3 people who knew the combination to the iron lock on the vault door. Myself, my father before he passed, and Edgar." Genevieve wrote something in her notebook. "And his background before Ravenwood Keep?" "He came with strong references from a baronet's estate in Hampshire. My father checked them thoroughly. Edgar was efficient, organized, and discreet. He never drank to excess, never gambled, never caused trouble with the female staff. The perfect steward by every measure." "The perfect steward," Genevieve repeated, her pencil pausing above the page. Those are often the most dangerous kind. A man with obvious flaws is easy to watch. A man without any is easy to overlook. The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, and Thaddeus reached for the leather strap hanging from the ceiling to steady himself. As he did, Genevieve produced a folded piece of paper from inside her shawl and handed it across to him. "This was recovered from the velvet lantern the night you saw me there. One of my contacts found it wedged beneath the table where Captain Greaves had been sitting. He must have dropped it during the commotion after you knocked over that lantern." Thaddeus took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a single sheet, covered on both sides with dense rows of letters and numbers that formed no recognizable words. A cipher, similar to the ones he had found in her trunk.
Can you read this?
Parts of it. The League uses several cipher systems, and the smuggling ring has adopted a modified version of one that was compromised 2 years ago. They changed enough of the key to make it difficult, but the underlying structure is the same. She leaned forward and pointed to a cluster of letters near the top of the page. "This sequence here refers to a location. I believe it corresponds to an estate in Oakhaven Valley."
Lord Stirling's manor.
Genevieve looked up at him. "You know it?"
Reginald Stirling. He inherited the manor from his uncle 5 years ago. He is known for hosting elaborate parties and for spending money faster than his lands can produce it. My father never trusted him, called him a man with champagne ambitions and ale pockets. A brief smile flickered across Genevieve's face before she turned her attention back to the letter.
"This second section is harder to decode,
but I can make out a reference to a date. 4 days from now. And this symbol here, which I have seen before in other intercepted correspondence, refers to an auction."
"An auction of stolen goods?"
"A private sale, conducted under the guise of a social gathering. Lord Stirling hosts a masked soirée every autumn. It is the perfect cover. Dozens of wealthy guests arriving in costumes, their identities concealed, their carriages lining the drive. No one would question a few unfamiliar faces among the crowd, and any exchange of goods could be disguised as ordinary party business."
Thaddeus stared at the coded letter in his hands. The pieces were falling into place with a neatness that made his jaw tighten. Edgar Poole feeding security details to the smuggling ring, Captain Greaves transporting the stolen relics by sea, and Lord Stirling providing the marketplace where buyers and sellers met under the cover of masks and music. "We need to get inside that soirée," he said.
"That is precisely why I am sitting in your carriage, Your Grace."
Genevieve tucked her notebook away and met his eyes directly. "You have a standing invitation to every society event in the county. I need you to accept Lord Stirling's. And I need you to bring a guest."
"A guest?"
"A foreign noblewoman, recently arrived from the continent, wealthy, curious, and very interested in acquiring rare historical pieces for her private collection. The kind of woman who would attract the attention of anyone looking to sell stolen artifacts to a discreet buyer." Thaddeus studied her face. The afternoon light coming through the carriage window caught the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the quiet determination in her eyes. He thought of the woman who had stood in his study that morning, head bowed, delivering his post with downcast eyes. The distance between that creature and the one sitting across from him now was staggering.
"You intend to pose as a noblewoman at a society ball."
"I intend to walk into a den of thieves and make them hand me the evidence we need to dismantle their entire operation." She paused, then added with the faintest edge of dry humor, "The dress and the title are simply the tools required for the job." Thaddeus folded the coded letter and slipped it into his breast pocket. Through the carriage window, the green hills of Oakhaven Valley were beginning to rise against the gray sky, and somewhere ahead, Lord Stirling's manor waited like a gilded trap.
"Then we had better find you something more convincing than a brown traveling dress," he said.
Genevieve raised an eyebrow. "I thought you would never offer."
Lord Stirling's manor blazed like a beacon against the dark October sky. Every window glowed with candlelight, and the long gravel drive was choked with carriages bearing the crests of half the noble families in the south of England. Footmen in powdered wigs stood at attention along the entrance steps, and the faint sound of a string quartet drifted through the open doors into the cool night air. Thaddeus adjusted his black silk mask and stepped down from his carriage. He wore his finest evening coat, dark navy with silver buttons, a crisp white cravat tied in a precise knot at his throat. He looked every inch the Duke of Oakhaven, which was exactly the point. Tonight, he was not hiding. He was the Bates escort, and all eyes needed to be on him long enough for Genevieve to do her work. He turned and offered his hand to the woman descending the carriage steps behind him. He had prepared himself for the transformation. He had told himself on the ride over that whatever she looked like, he would keep his composure and play his part. He was a grown man, a duke, a person of discipline and self-control. None of that mattered. Genevieve stepped into the torchlight, and Thaddeus forgot how to form words. She wore a gown of deep burgundy velvet that caught the firelight and turned it to wine. The bodice was fitted with delicate gold embroidery along the neckline, and her dark hair had been swept up and pinned with small garnet combs that glittered like drops of blood against black silk. A gold mask covered the upper half of her face, leaving only her jaw and her lips visible. Around her neck hung a single pendant on a thin chain, borrowed from a jeweler in the valley town that afternoon. She placed her gloved hand in his, and her fingers were perfectly steady. "Breathe, Your Grace," she murmured as she stepped down beside him. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Something far more alarming than a ghost," he managed. They climbed the stone steps together, arm in arm, and were announced at the door as the Duke of Oakhaven and the Contessa Elara Montague of Verona. The name had been Genevieve's invention, chosen because it was foreign enough to intrigue and impossible to verify quickly. By the time anyone thought to check, the evening would be long over. The grand ballroom was magnificent and suffocating in equal measure. Crystal chandeliers hung from the painted ceiling, casting prisms of light across the marble floor. Masked guests moved in clusters, their laughter sharp and their jewels sharper. The air smelled of French perfume, hot candle wax, and the faint sweetness of champagne. Lord Stirling himself greeted them near the entrance. He was a tall, thin man with a narrow face and a smile that showed too many teeth. His mask was elaborate, a golden fox with pointed ears, and he wore a coat of emerald green silk that probably cost more than most of his tenants earned in a year. "Oakhaven, what a pleasure," Stirling said, clasping Thaddeus's hand with both of his own. "And who is this exquisite creature on your arm?" "The Contessa Montague," Thaddeus replied smoothly. "A dear friend of my late mother's family. She is visiting from the continent and expressed a keen interest in English country society." Genevieve extended her hand with a grace that belonged in a royal court. "Lord Stirling, your home is breathtaking. I have heard wonderful things about your collection of antiquities. I am something of a collector myself." Stirling's eyes brightened behind his golden fox mask. Thaddeus could practically see the man's mind calculating potential profit. "A collector? How delightful. You must allow me to show you some of my private pieces later this evening. I have recently acquired some extraordinary items that I think a woman of your refined taste would appreciate." "I would be honored," Genevieve said, with a warm smile that carried just enough mystery to keep him hooked. Stirling kissed her hand and moved on to greet the next arriving guests, but Thaddeus caught the way his gaze lingered on Genevieve for a moment longer than politeness required. The hook was set. They moved deeper into the ballroom, and Genevieve immediately went to work. She had a remarkable ability to draw people toward her without appearing to try. Within 20 minutes, she had engaged 3 separate groups in conversation, each time steering the discussion gently toward art, heritage,
and the regrettable rise of artifact theft across England.
She listened more than she spoke, tilting her head with interest, laughing softly at the right moments, and asking the kind of questions that made people reveal far more than they intended. Thaddeus watched her from across the room, a glass of champagne in his hand that he barely touched. He was supposed to be playing the role of a proud escort, mingling with old acquaintances, keeping up appearances. And he did, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with barons and viscounts and their wives, but his attention kept drifting back to her. She was speaking now with a stout gentleman in a red waistcoat who Thaddeus recognized as Lord Pemberton, a known collector with a questionable reputation for acquiring pieces through unofficial channels. Genevieve leaned in close, said something that made Pemberton's eyebrows rise above his mask, and the man immediately took her by the elbow and guided her toward a quiet alcove near the library doors. Thaddeus forced himself to stay put. She knew what she was doing. She had done this dozens of times before, in dozens of houses, with dozens of men who never suspected that the charming woman hanging on their every word was memorizing their secrets. 10 minutes later, Genevieve reappeared at his side as if she had never left. She linked her arm through his and leaned close enough that her lips nearly brushed his ear.
Pemberton confirmed it. The private auction is happening tonight, downstairs in the wine cellars. Sterling has converted a section of the vaults into a showroom. The Aethelgard relics are among the lots being offered. And there is a second entrance through a service corridor behind the kitchens.
Thaddeus set his champagne glass on a passing footman's tray. Then let us go and find my family's treasure. Genevieve squeezed his arm once, briefly, and together they turned away from the music and the laughter and the glittering masks, walking calmly toward the servants' corridor at the far end of the hall. The servants' corridor was narrow and undecorated, a sharp contrast to the gilded ballroom they had just left. Plain stone walls, a low ceiling, and the smell of cooking grease drifting from the kitchens ahead. Genevieve moved with the confidence of someone who had already studied the layout of the house, and Thaddeus followed close behind, their footsteps muffled by the worn carpet runner beneath their feet. "How do you know about this passage?" he whispered. "I spent yesterday afternoon in the village, buying ribbons from a seamstress who happens to be the sister of Lord Sterling's kitchen maid. Remarkable how much people will share over a cup of tea and a friendly ear." She glanced back at him with a slight smile. "The service corridor connects the kitchen to the old wine cellars. Sterling had a new wall built 6 months ago to section off the far end of the vaults. His staff were told it was for storing rare vintages. None of them have been permitted to enter." They passed the kitchen entrance, where the clatter of dishes and the raised voice of a harried cook covered any sound they made. Beyond the kitchen, the corridor turned sharply to the left and descended a flight of stone steps. The air grew cooler with each step, and the music from the ballroom above faded to a dull murmur through the thick ceiling. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. A single oil lamp burned on a hook beside it, casting a weak circle of amber light across the flagstones. Genevieve pressed her palm flat against the door and eased it open inch by inch. The wine cellars of Lord Sterling's manor were vast. Long rows of oak barrels stretched away into the darkness on either side, and tall racks of dusty bottles lined the walls like the shelves of some underground library. The ceiling was vaulted brick, and the air carried the sweet, heavy scent of old wine and damp earth. They moved between the barrel rows in silence, Genevieve leading the way with one hand trailing lightly along the wooden casks to guide herself in the dim light. Thaddeus kept his breathing steady and his ears open. Somewhere above them, 100 guests danced and drank, completely unaware of what lay beneath their polished shoes. After 30 yards, the cellar opened into a wider chamber, and Genevieve stopped. She held up one hand, and Thaddeus went still beside her. Ahead of them stood a wall that clearly did not belong. The original stonework of the cellar was centuries old, rough-cut and weathered. This wall was newer, built from smooth dressed stone and fitted with a heavy iron door that would have looked more at home on a bank vault than a wine cellar. A brass padlock the size of a man's fist secured the latch. Genevieve reached into the bodice of her gown and produced the iron key she had received from Captain Greaves at the Velvet Lantern. Thaddeus stared at it.
That key? You knew it would open this door? I suspected. Captain Greaves uses this vault as a staging point before loading cargo onto his ship. The key was my price for the false inventory. He believed he was buying my silence and cooperation. What he actually purchased was our way in. She fitted the key into the padlock, and it turned with a smooth, heavy click that echoed through the silent cellar.
The iron door swung inward on oiled hinges, revealing a chamber beyond that made Thaddeus catch his breath. The room was perhaps 20 feet square, lit by 4 oil lamps mounted on iron brackets along the walls. Wooden crates of various sizes were stacked neatly against every surface, some open, some sealed with wax and stamped with shipping marks. Straw packing material littered the floor, and there, on a long table in the center of the room, arranged on beds of black velvet like exhibits in a museum, sat the Ethelgard relics. Thaddeus moved forward as though pulled by an invisible thread. The great Saxon chalice, its gold surface etched with intertwining serpents and set with cabochon garnets. The twin brooches of Ethelgard, their cloisonné enamel still vivid after 1,000 years. The ceremonial dagger with its ivory handle and gold filigree blade. And the centerpiece of the collection, the Ethelgard crown, a circlet of hammered gold studded with rough-cut sapphires that his father had called the finest surviving example of 9th century English metalwork in existence. He reached out and touched the crown with trembling fingers. The metal was cold and solid and real. 3 months of searching, and here it was, sitting in a smuggler's basement, waiting to be shipped across the channel to disappear forever into some foreign collector's private hoard. Your Grace? Genevieve's voice was soft but urgent.
She was standing beside one of the sealed crates, examining the shipping label pasted to its side.
These crates are marked for departure tomorrow evening. A vessel called the Iron Petrel, departing from Pier 4 at Brimstone Bay. Captain Greaves's ship.
Then we take everything now, load it into my carriage and drive straight to the magistrate.
We cannot carry all of this ourselves, and your carriage is parked in full view of 100 guests and their coachman. We need the shipping manifest. It will contain the names of buyers, sellers, and every estate that has been robbed. That document alone will bring down the entire operation.
She began searching the table drawers while Thaddeus checked the crates nearest the door. They worked quickly, fingers sorting through packing straw and loose papers, the lamplight throwing their shadows large against the vault walls. Genevieve found it, a leather folio tucked inside a wooden box beneath the table, containing page after page of detailed records. Names, dates, locations, prices, shipping routes, the entire architecture of the smuggling ring, written out in careful copperplate handwriting. She held it up, her eyes bright with triumph behind her gold mask. Then they both heard it. Footsteps, coming down the stone stairs. More than one pair, moving with purpose and growing louder with every second. Genevieve closed the folio and pressed it against her chest. She looked at Thaddeus, and for the first time that evening, he saw real urgency in her face. That will be Sterling's men, coming to seal the crates for transport, she whispered. We have about 30 seconds before they reach this door. Thaddeus looked at the iron door, then back at her. Tell me you have a plan. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Genevieve grabbed his wrist and pulled him toward the shadows behind the tallest stack of crates. I always have a plan. The voices reached the vault door before the men did. 2 of them, speaking in low, clipped tones that echoed off the cellar walls. Thaddeus pressed himself flat against the cold stone behind the stack of crates, his shoulder touching Genevieve's.
She had one arm wrapped around the leather folio and her other hand raised, palm out, signaling him to stay still and stay silent. Through the narrow gap between the crates, Thaddeus could see the iron door swing fully open. 2 men entered. The first was a broad, heavy-set fellow in a dockworker's coat, carrying a coil of thick rope over one shoulder and a hammer in his belt. The second man made Thaddeus's blood turn to ice. Edgar Poole. His estate steward walked into the underground vault as comfortably as he walked into the morning room at Ravenwood Keep. He wore his usual dark brown coat, buttoned neatly, and carried a sheaf of papers under one arm. His thin face was calm, businesslike, entirely at ease in a room full of stolen heritage. "We need these 6 crates sealed and marked before midnight," Poole said, tapping the nearest box with his knuckle. "Greaves wants them loaded at first light. The tide turns at 7, and he will not wait." The dock worker grunted and set down his rope. "What about the loose pieces on the table?" "Pack them last. Lord Sterling wants to show them to a buyer upstairs before they go into the crates. Some Italian woman, apparently, throwing money around like confetti." Poole's lip curled slightly. "These foreign collectors are all the same, more wealth than sense." Thaddeus felt Genevieve stiffen beside him. The Italian woman. They were talking about her. The Contessa Montague, the character she had invented barely 3 hours ago, had already made its way down to the smugglers in the cellar. Sterling had taken the bait completely. Poole moved to the table and began sorting through the remaining papers in the wooden box where the folio had been. His hands paused. He lifted the box and looked underneath it. Then he checked the table drawers, one after another, each one sliding open and shut with a sharp wooden clack. "The manifest is gone," he said. The dock worker looked up from the crate he was roping. "What?" "The shipping manifest. The full ledger. It was in this box an hour ago. I put it here myself." Poole's voice had changed. The calm efficiency was cracking, and something harder was pushing through underneath. He scanned the room with quick, suspicious eyes, and Thaddeus held his breath as that gaze swept across the stack of crates hiding them. "Could Sterling have moved it upstairs?" the dock worker offered. "Sterling does not touch the paperwork. That was the arrangement. He provides the space, I provide the logistics, and Greaves provides the transport." Poole straightened up, and his expression had gone very cold. "Someone has been in here." This was the moment. Thaddeus could feel it tipping, the narrow window between discovery and escape shrinking with every second. If Poole decided to search the room, they were finished. 2 people crouched behind a wall of crates in a locked underground chamber with 1 exit and 2 men standing between them and the door. Genevieve moved. She did it so smoothly that Thaddeus almost missed it. While both men had their backs partially turned, she reached down and picked up a loose chunk of stone from the floor, about the size of a hen's egg. Then she drew her arm back and hurled it through the gap at the top of the crate stack, sending it sailing over the men's heads and through the open iron door. It struck the far wall of the outer cellar with a sharp crack that rang through the vaulted space like a pistol shot. Both men spun toward the door. "Who is there?" Poole barked, striding forward. The dockworker followed, his hand reaching for the hammer in his belt. The instant they crossed the threshold, Genevieve was on her feet and running. She reached the iron door in 4 strides, grabbed its heavy edge with both hands, and swung it shut with every ounce of strength in her body. The door slammed home with a deep metallic boom that shook dust from the ceiling. Thaddeus was beside her half a second later, and together they drove the bolt across. The padlock was still hanging from the outer latch where Genevieve had left it, and she snapped it shut with a decisive click. From inside, Poole's fist hit the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Open this door! Open it now!" "That bolt will hold them for a while," Genevieve said, already moving back toward the stairs. "The door was built to keep people out of the vault, which means it works just as well keeping them in." They took the stone steps 2 at a time, Genevieve clutching the folio against her ribs and Thaddeus right behind her. The servants' corridor above was still empty, the kitchen staff too occupied with the demands of the party to notice two breathless figures emerging from the cellar entrance. They slipped through the kitchen passage and out through a side door that opened onto the manor gardens. The night air hit Thaddeus's face like cold water, and he gulped it down in deep lungfuls. The gardens stretched out before them in silver moonlight, formal hedgerows casting long geometric shadows across the gravel paths.
Beyond the garden wall, the stable yard was alive with the soft sounds of waiting horses and idle coachmen sharing tobacco.
"My carriage is near the eastern gate," Thaddeus said, steering them along the hedge line toward the back of the stable yard. "If we leave now, we can reach the main road before anyone realizes those two are locked in the cellar." "We need to reach Brimstone Bay before dawn," Genevieve said, her voice steady despite the pace of their walk. "The Iron Petrel is scheduled to depart tomorrow evening, but if Greaves gets word that Poole has been compromised, he will weigh anchor early and vanish with whatever cargo is already on board." They reached the carriage. Thaddeus dismissed the drowsy coachman with a quick instruction to find his own way home in the morning, then climbed up onto the driver's seat himself and took the reins. Genevieve paused at the carriage door and looked up at him.
The gold mask was still on her face, and the moonlight turned the garnets in her hair to dark fire.
"Can you handle a 4-horse team at speed through the night, Your Grace?" Thaddeus gathered the reins and set his jaw. "Get inside and hold on to that folio. We are not losing those relics to the morning tide." She climbed in and pulled the door shut. He snapped the reins, and the horses surged forward into the darkness. The coastal highway from Oakhaven Valley to Brimstone Bay was a treacherous stretch of road even in daylight. At night, with a heavy autumn rain beginning to fall, and only the pale wash of moonlight breaking through the clouds, it was something close to madness. Thaddeus did not care. The 4 horses pulled hard against the traces, their hooves striking sparks from the wet stone where the road surface had worn thin. The carriage swayed and rattled behind them as the highway wound along the edge of the chalk cliffs, the dark sea churning far below.
Thaddeus could taste salt on his lips and feel the rain soaking through his evening coat, but his hands were steady on the reins and his eyes were locked on the road ahead.
He had driven this route 100 times as a younger man, racing his university friends along the cliff tops for sport, terrifying the local farmers and earning sharp lectures from his father about the dignity expected of a future duke. Those reckless afternoons were paying dividends now. He knew every bend, every dip, every place where the road narrowed to a single track between the hedgerow and the cliff edge. The carriage window slid open behind him, and Genevieve's voice cut through the wind and rain. "Riders behind us, 3 of them, coming fast from the valley road." Thaddeus risked a glance over his shoulder. Through the curtain of rain, he could make out the distant flicker of lantern light bouncing along the road perhaps half a mile back.
3 horsemen riding hard, their mounts throwing up sprays of mud and gravel. Someone at Stirling's manor had discovered the locked vault sooner than expected, and word had been sent out.
"How far to Brimstone Bay?"
Genevieve called.
7 miles, maybe 8 along this stretch. The road straightens after Whitecombe Hill, and we will make better time on the flat." "They are gaining on us. A single horse moves faster on this terrain than a carriage team."
She was right. He could feel it in the mathematics of the chase. 4 horses pulling a heavy coach against 3 unladen riders on fresh mounts. On a straight road, his team could outpace them through sheer endurance. On these winding cliff paths, the riders had the advantage of agility, cutting corners and taking lines that the wide carriage could never follow. He needed to change the calculation.
"There is a fork ahead, just past the old shepherd's cottage," he shouted back through the window.
"The left road goes down through the village of Whitecombe. The right is a drover's track that cuts straight across the headland to the coast road above Brimstone Bay. It is rougher, but it is 2 miles shorter."
"Take the drover's track."
The fork appeared out of the rain-soaked darkness moments later. A crumbling stone wall marked the junction, and a weathered signpost pointed left toward Whitecombe. Thaddeus hauled the reins to the right, and the horses swung onto the unpaved track with a lurch that nearly threw him from the driver's seat. The carriage bounced violently as the wheels hit the rutted earth, and he heard something heavy slide and crash inside the cabin.
"Are you all right?"
he called. "Still here, still have the folio. Your driving, however, leaves something to be desired." Despite everything, he almost laughed. The drover's track was brutal. Meant for cattle and sheep, it was barely wide enough for the carriage, and the rain had turned the earth to thick, sucking mud that grabbed at the wheels with every rotation. The horses labored, their breath coming in great white plumes, their flanks dark with sweat and rain. Thaddeus urged them on with voice and rein, keeping the pace as high as the terrain would allow. Behind them, the lantern lights hesitated at the fork. Thaddeus watched them pause, cluster together for a moment of confusion, and then swing left toward Whitecombe. They had taken the obvious road, expecting the carriage to follow the easier path. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. The drover's track climbed steadily for another mile before cresting the headland and beginning its descent toward the coast. As they reached the top, the clouds broke apart for a brief moment, and moonlight flooded the landscape. Below them, spread out along the curve of the bay like a handful of scattered jewels, lay Brimstone Bay. The harbor lights twinkled in the rain, and the dark shapes of ships rocked gently at their moorings. Somewhere among them sat the Iron Petrel, loaded with stolen history and waiting for the morning tide. The descent was steep, and Thaddeus had to fight the reins to keep the horses from bolting downhill under the weight of the carriage pushing at their backs. He used the brake lever with his foot, the iron shoe grinding against the rear wheel with a sound that set his teeth on edge. Slowly, carefully, they wound their way down through gorse and heather until the track met the proper coast road at the bottom. The road surface changed from mud to cobblestone, and the carriage steadied. Thaddeus felt the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. 2 miles to the harbor. The riders were somewhere behind them on the wrong road, and the night was still on their side. Genevieve opened the carriage window again. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, dark strands falling around her face, and the gold mask was gone, probably lost during the rough passage over the headland. Her eyes were bright, almost fierce, and the leather folio was gripped tightly in both hands against her chest.
"The harbour master's office is on the western quay, near Pier 2, she said. "His name is Josiah Kemble. He is a Crown appointee and has been briefed on the League's operations in this area. If we can reach him with this manifest before Greaves catches wind of what has happened, he can impound the Iron Petrel and seize everything on board."
"And if Greaves has already been warned?"
"Then we will be standing on an empty dock, watching our evidence sail out of the harbour mouth."
Thaddeus cracked the reins one final time, and the horses found a last reserve of strength, surging forward along the cobbled road toward the glowing lights of Brimstone Bay. The rain was easing now, the clouds pulling apart to reveal scattered stars above the dark water. They had gambled everything on speed and a cattle track through the mud. In a matter of minutes, they would find out if it had been enough. The harbor of Brimstone Bay was quiet in the grey half-light before dawn. Fishing boats rocked gently in their berths, their masts swaying like metronomes against the pale sky. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming, and the air smelled of tar, wet rope, and the sharp brine of the open sea. Thaddeus brought the carriage to a halt near the harbour master's office, a squat stone building at the head of the western quay, with a single lamp burning in its ground-floor window. The horses stood steaming in the cool air, their sides heaving from the long drive. He climbed down from the driver's seat, his legs stiff and his evening coat ruined beyond any tailor's redemption, and opened the carriage door for Genevieve. She stepped out with the leather folio still pressed against her body like a shield. Her burgundy gown was creased and mud splattered along the hem, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders where the pins had given up their battle somewhere on the drover's track. She looked nothing like the polished Contessa who had turned heads at Lord Stirling's soiree a few hours earlier, and yet Thaddeus thought she had never appeared more formidable.
"Wait here,"
she said, and walked straight to the harbour-master's door. She knocked 3 times in a particular rhythm, paused, then knocked twice more, a code clearly prearranged. The door opened, and a stout man with a weathered face and a thick grey mustache peered out. He wore a heavy wool coat thrown over what appeared to be a nightshirt, and his eyes were sharp despite the early hour.
"Mercer?" he said, squinting at her. "Josiah, I need you to mobilize every man you have. Pier 4, the Iron Petrel. She cannot leave this harbor."
Kemble looked past her at Thaddeus, who stood by the carriage looking like a man who had been dragged backwards through a hedgerow in formal evening wear.
"And him?"
"The Duke of Oakhaven. He is with me."
"A duke?" Kemble scratched his mustache thoughtfully. "Right. You had better both come inside."
The harbour-master's office was a cramped room filled with charts, ledgers, and the lingering smell of pipe tobacco. Kemble cleared a stack of papers from his desk, and Genevieve laid the folio open before him. She talked quickly and precisely, walking him through the contents of the manifest. Names of buyers across France and the Low Countries, shipping dates going back 18 months, detailed inventories of stolen artifacts from a dozen noble estates, including the Ethelgard relics. And at the center of it all, the names of the 3 men who ran the operation:
Captain Alistair Greaves, Lord Reginald Stirling, and Edgar Poole, estate steward to the Duke of Oakhaven. Kemble listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every page. When Genevieve finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. "I have 6 harbour guards on the morning watch. I can have them at Pier 4 in 10 minutes. But if Greaves resists, this could get complicated."
"He will have no grounds to resist," Genevieve said. "The manifest constitutes evidence of organized theft and smuggling across Crown territories. Under maritime authority, you have the legal power to impound any vessel suspected of carrying stolen goods. Greaves knows this. He is a practical man. When he sees the evidence laid out and armed guards on his deck, he will calculate his odds and surrender."
"And if he has already set sail?"
"Then we have lost the cargo on board, but we still have the manifest, and every name in this folio will face prosecution."
She paused and looked at Thaddeus.
"But I do not think he has sailed. The tide does not turn for another hour, and Greaves would never risk the harbour channel in the dark. He will wait for first light."
Kemble stood, pulled on his boots, and reached for his coat.
"Pier 4 it is, then. Stay behind me and let my men do their work." They walked out into the breaking dawn. The sky above the eastern headland was turning from grey to pale gold, and the first gulls of the morning were circling above the fishing boats, their cries thin and sharp in the still air. Kemble moved with a military efficiency that suggested a career at sea before his appointment as harbour-master, and within minutes, 6 guards in the dark blue coats of the Port Authority had assembled on the quay, each carrying a lantern and a weighted truncheon at his belt. They marched in formation along the waterfront toward Pier 4, their boots striking the wet stone in unison. Thaddeus walked beside Genevieve at the rear of the group, and as they rounded the final warehouse, the Iron Petrel came into view. She was a 2-masted brigantine, sitting low in the water under the weight of her cargo. Her hull was dark, her sails furled, and a thin trail of smoke rose from her galley chimney. On her deck, a handful of crew members were moving about in the early morning routine, coiling ropes and checking rigging. At the stern, standing with his hands on the rail and a clay pipe clamped between his teeth, was Captain Alistair Greaves himself. He saw them coming. His pipe hand froze halfway to his mouth, and even from 50 yards away, Thaddeus could see the rapid calculation happening behind those weathered eyes. Greaves looked at the harbour guards, he looked at Kemble, he looked at Genevieve, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, followed immediately by understanding. Kemble halted his men at the foot of the gangplank and called up in a voice that carried across the entire harbor. "Captain Greaves, by the authority vested in me as Crown Harbor Master of Brimstone Bay, I am ordering the immediate inspection and impoundment of this vessel on suspicion of transporting stolen property. You will instruct your crew to stand down and permit my men aboard." Greaves removed the pipe from his mouth and looked down at the line of blue-coated guards. He looked at the manifest in Genevieve's hands. He looked out toward the harbor mouth, where the open sea glinted in the first rays of sunrise, and for a moment Thaddeus thought the captain was going to order his crew to cast off and run. Then Greaves sighed, a deep, tired sound, and tapped his pipe against the rail, scattering ash into the water below. "Stand down, lads," he called to his crew. "Party is over." The harbor guards marched up the gangplank, and Genevieve followed, with the manifest open, directing them toward the cargo hold. Thaddeus stood on the dock, watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of amber and rose, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for 3 long months. The Ethelgard relics were coming home. 2 days passed before the full weight of what they had accomplished settled over Ravenwood Keep like dust after a storm. The morning after the seizure of the Iron Petrel, constables from the county magistrate's office arrived at Lord Stirling's manor with a warrant. Stirling was found in his study, still wearing his golden fox mask from the soiree, slumped in an armchair with an empty bottle of brandy and the resigned expression of a man who had always known this day would come. He offered no resistance and was escorted to the county jail in a closed carriage, his elaborate emerald coat drawing stares from every farmhand along the road. Edgar Poole and the dock worker were discovered still locked inside the underground vault, having spent the entire night hammering on the iron door and shouting themselves hoarse. Poole, unlike Stirling, had plenty to say. He cursed, he denied, he threatened legal action against everyone from the harbour master to the king himself. His protests lasted precisely as long as it took for the constables to show him the shipping manifest bearing his own handwriting. After that, he went very quiet and stayed that way. Captain Greaves, ever the pragmatist, cooperated fully with the authorities in exchange for the possibility of a lighter sentence. He provided names, dates, and routes that filled in the remaining gaps in the League's intelligence. By the second evening, the entire smuggling network that had been draining England's noble estates of their historical treasures was laid bare like the skeleton of a beached ship. And through all of it, Genevieve Mercer had simply returned to her duties at Ravenwood Keep as though nothing had happened. Thaddeus found this deeply unsettling. He would pass her in the corridor, and she would curtsy and lower her gaze, the perfect portrait of a modest housemaid. And he would have to remind himself that 48 hours earlier, this same woman had been decoding smugglers' ciphers in his carriage and locking traitors in underground vaults. The contrast was maddening. Like watching a master painter pretend to be a house decorator, carefully applying whitewash to a garden fence, while a cathedral ceiling waited for her brush. He wanted to speak with her, but the opportunity never arose naturally. The house was in turmoil over Poole's arrest. The remaining staff whispered in corners and fell silent whenever Thaddeus entered a room. Mrs. Alford cried twice into her bread dough, claiming she had always sensed something wrong about Poole, but had never wanted to speak ill of a colleague. Jennings, the old butler, maintained his composure with the rigid discipline of a man who considered visible emotion a professional failing. But Thaddeus caught him checking the locks on every door in the house 3 times in a single afternoon. On the morning of the 8th day, a carriage bearing the crest of the Crown's Antiquities League arrived at the front gates of Ravenwood Keep. Thaddeus watched from his study window as 2 men and a woman stepped out. The men wore dark, well-tailored coats and carried leather document cases. The woman was older, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back under a sensible hat and an air of quiet authority that suggested she was accustomed to being the most important person in any room she entered.
This, Thaddeus would later learn, was Mrs. Helena Ashworth, the Director of Field Operations for the League, Genevieve's superior. They were received in the Great Hall, the finest room in Ravenwood Keep. Oak-paneled walls rose to a hammer-beam ceiling darkened by 3 centuries of hearth smoke. Portraits of Vance ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes gazing down with varying degrees of approval. A fire crackled in the enormous stone fireplace, and Jennings had laid out the best silver tea service on the long refectory table. Genevieve stood near the fireplace in her grey maid's dress, looking distinctly uncomfortable for the first time since Thaddeus had known her. She kept smoothing her apron with her palms, a nervous gesture he had never seen from her before. It occurred to him that facing smugglers and sea captains in dark taverns was apparently less stressful for her than standing in a grand room while important people spoke about her. Mrs. Ashworth addressed Thaddeus first. "Your Grace, on behalf of the Crown's Antiquities League, I wish to extend our deepest gratitude for your assistance in this matter. The recovery of the Ethelgard relics, along with artifacts from 11 other estates, represents one of the most significant operations in the League's history. Your cooperation and discretion were invaluable." "I think you will find that the credit belongs almost entirely to Miss Mercer," Thaddeus replied, glancing toward the fireplace. "I merely drove the carriage." Mrs. Ashworth permitted herself a thin smile. "Miss Mercer's contributions are well known to us, Your Grace. Which brings me to the second purpose of our visit." She turned to Genevieve and opened one of the leather document cases. From it, she produced a folded parchment bearing a heavy wax seal and a ribbon in the League's colors of deep blue and gold. "Genevieve Mercer, it is my honor to present you with your official discharge from active field service, along with a commendation for exceptional duty and a financial reward commensurate with the significance of your achievements." She held out the parchment. "Your mission at Ravenwood Keep is formally complete. You are released from your cover assignment effective immediately." Genevieve took the parchment with both hands. She held it for a long moment, looking down at the seal, and Thaddeus saw something cross her face that he could not quite name. Relief, perhaps, or the strange hollowness that comes when a purpose that has defined your days is suddenly finished. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashworth," she said quietly. The officials stayed for tea, during which they discussed the logistics of returning the recovered artifacts to their rightful owners. The Ethelgard relics would remain at Ravenwood Keep, restored to the vault where they belonged, this time with substantially improved security arrangements. When the League's carriage finally rolled back down the drive and disappeared through the gates, Thaddeus stood in the entrance hall and realized that the knot in his stomach had nothing to do with stolen relics or smuggling rings or treacherous stewards. Genevieve's mission was over. Her cover was dissolved. She had no reason to remain at Ravenwood Keep, no obligation to stay, and no role that required her presence under his roof for even one more day. She was going to leave. And standing there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors and the lingering scent of Mrs. Ashworth's lavender water, Thaddeus discovered that this thought frightened him far more than any smuggler or midnight chase along rain-soaked cliffs ever had. Thaddeus did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with a glass of brandy he never drank, staring at the fire until the logs collapsed into embers and the room grew cold. Twice he stood up and walked to the door, intending to go to the servants' wing and say something to her. Both times he turned back, because he had no idea what that something should be. He was a duke. She was a woman who had spent 14 months scrubbing his floors as a disguise. The distance between those two facts should have made the situation simple. It made it impossible instead. By morning, his mind was no clearer, but his resolve had hardened into something that felt almost like courage. He dressed without calling for his valet, choosing a simple dark coat and leaving his cravat looser than Jennings would have approved. Then he went downstairs and found Mrs. Alford in the kitchen, elbow deep in pastry dough.
Has Genevieve come down yet? Mrs. Alfred wiped her forehead with a floury hand.
She has, Your Grace. Came down at first light, packed her trunk, and settled her wages with Jennings. She is in the rose garden, I believe. Said she wanted to walk the grounds one last time before the afternoon coach.
The afternoon coach. She was leaving today. The words hit him like a bucket of cold water, and he was out of the kitchen and through the back door before Mrs. Alfred could ask if he wanted his breakfast. The rose garden at Ravenwood Keep was his mother's creation. She had designed it 30 years ago, planting every bush herself, arranging the paths in gentle curves that led inward toward a stone pavilion at the center. The pavilion was a simple structure, 4 columns supporting a domed roof covered in climbing roses, with a wooden bench inside where his mother had spent countless afternoons reading while the garden grew up around her. After her death, Thaddeus's father had maintained it with almost religious devotion, and Thaddeus had continued the tradition. It was the most peaceful place on the entire estate, and somehow it did not surprise him at all that Genevieve had found her way there. She was sitting on the bench inside the pavilion, her packed trunk standing upright on the gravel path beside the steps. She wore her brown traveling dress and the dark shawl from their carriage ride to Oakhaven Valley, and her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in loose waves. On her lap sat the folded parchment from Mrs. Ashworth, the discharge papers that had ended her life as a housemaid and a spy in a single stroke. The September sun was warm on the garden, and the last roses of the season were still holding their color along the trellises, deep reds and pale pinks, and a climbing yellow variety that his mother had brought back from a visit to Kent. The light came through the petals and threw soft patterns across the pavilion floor, and Genevieve sat in the middle of it all like a portrait in a frame she was about to step out of forever. She looked up as he approached. Her expression was composed, but her eyes held something that he recognized, because he felt it too. The particular ache of leaving a place that had become more than what it was supposed to be. "Your Grace," she said, and started to rise. "Stay where you are, please." He climbed the pavilion steps and stood in front of her, suddenly aware that he had rehearsed nothing, and that every clever phrase he had ever learned at university had abandoned him entirely. "Mrs. Alfred tells me you are leaving on the afternoon coach."
I am. My work here is finished, and there is no reason for me to remain on your household staff under false pretenses.
"No, there is not." He paused, choosing his next words with the same care he imagined she used when constructing her ciphers. "But I am not asking you to remain on my household staff." Genevieve tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was working through a puzzle, and said nothing. Thaddeus sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them, and looked out at the garden rather than at her face, because looking at her face was making it very difficult to think in complete sentences. "I've spent the last 9 days watching you do extraordinary things," he said. "I have watched you outwit smugglers, decode ciphers, charm an entire ballroom of aristocrats, and lock my own steward in an underground vault. I have seen you ride through a rainstorm on a cattle track without losing your composure or your grip on the single most important document in the south of England. And through all of it, the thing that has astonished me most is that you did every bit of it while the rest of the world believed you were a shy woman who could not make eye contact over a tea tray." He turned to look at her then, and found her watching him with an expression he had never seen before. Open, unguarded. The mask of the meek servant was gone, and the sharp focus of the field agent had softened into something warmer. "My family's collection nearly vanished because I trusted the wrong people and overlooked the right ones," he continued. "I do not intend to make that mistake again. Ravenwood Keep needs someone who understands the value of what these walls contain. Someone with the knowledge to protect it and the intelligence to see threats that a man like me would walk straight past. I am offering you the position of curator of the Vance collection, with full authority over its preservation and security." Genevieve looked down at the discharge papers in her lap, then back up at him.
You are offering me a position.
I am offering you a place. Here, at Ravenwood Keep. He hesitated, and then pressed forward past the last wall of propriety and caution that stood between what he should say and what he needed to say. And I am asking you to stay because the thought of you walking down that drive and disappearing from my life the way you disappeared from that tavern in Brimstone Bay is something I find I cannot bear. I am not speaking to you as a duke addressing a former servant. I am speaking as a man who has had the good fortune to discover that the most remarkable woman he has ever met was living under his roof all along, and who would very much like her to go on living there. The garden was quiet. A blackbird sang somewhere in the hedgerow, the roses moved gently in the warm breeze, and the sunlight shifted across the pavilion floor. Genevieve folded the discharge papers once, tucked them inside her shawl, and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes that had seen through every disguise and every deception for 4 years running. "Then I suppose I shall need to unpack my trunk," she said. And there, in the pavilion, among his mother's roses, with the September sun pouring gold across the stone, Thaddeus Vance laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. And Genevieve Mercer smiled, the first true smile he had ever seen from her. And neither of them looked away.